Hello. Uh, Welcome to the RK Roundup. My name is Shashank RK. This is our first episode. We are live here from the heart of Brooklyn, New York, in the USA. We'll get into introductions later, but we're going to start with the first big story of the week. This past week, the UK voted overwhelmingly, very sadly, to re-elect the pro-Brexit Tory government and clown fascist Boris Johnson for yet another term as Prime Minister. A stunning defeat of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. And obviously a very big hit to, people who don't want racism and bigotry and nativism to be the calling card of the West, and also just generally bad for the material conditions of the UK working class. But it also speaks to the effectiveness of the Tory party, their ability to appropriate pro-working class talking points, run very effective smear campaigns against the left, aided and abetted by the British media that was also attacking Corbyn to fit its own political goals, and just generally not good. Just generally not good. So, one of the big narratives that came out of the UK elections is we're seeing this in pretty much every major news media outlet, which is Corbyn's defeat signals a certain kind of message on the effectiveness of left politics around the world. And it's astonishing to me how incredibly, I guess, high school level that kind of analysis is. It's a very see left lose, left bad, right better, need center win. But the truth is that Corbyn's defeat comes from something much more sinister and much more long term, which was a severe messaging issue. Sorry. Do not disturb doesn't cover emergency alerts. We can edit that out. So, the news media's coverage here, it signals a significant lack of ability to really properly apply a critical analysis to what really happened. Corbyn's defeat comes from a couple of factors. One of the main ones that you can actually attribute to him that definitely was the fault of Labour in general, but also kind of one of the kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of situation, in which Labour was a giant coalition of pro-Brexit, anti-Brexit, largely pro-Labour left-wingers, but also kind of center-lefters, a very mixed, diverse coalition, which led Corbyn essentially, just like he did during the Brexit campaign, which he took a lot of flack for, not to take a really hard stance on Brexit, because there were several seats in several areas of the UK in which campaigning against Brexit was actually going to lose you Labour voters because many of them were pro-leave. And the political reality for Corbyn was that Labour had to continue to have an ambiguous message on Brexit in order to cater to both their pro-Remain and pro-leave voters, without either of whom they had no chance of winning the election. Of course, in retrospect, they had no chance anyway. But that messaging really hurt them in their constituencies. And then the second thing, which is a bit more of a parallel to the U.S., which was the extremely effective and constant and really not explicitly but implicitly coordinated media smear campaigns that were constantly run against Corbyn. And there's a couple of parallels here, and but drawing a parallel between Corbyn and Bernie Sanders in terms of their viability as candidates doesn't have the kind of merit when it comes to saying, oh yeah, left loses because left doesn't appeal to a broad base of voters. It's more left loses because in the left, in the UK, the left basically had this extremely unclear, very muddy messaging that whether or not it was something they could have changed, it was the reality of what they faced, and it caused them to lose very crucial votes. And then the second thing is obviously media smear campaigns are going to smear. And while definitely there is a mainstream media bias against Bernie Sanders, and it's very, even as somebody who was constantly fighting against that narrative years ago, really applying any critical thinking to it and looking at the way that news media constantly cover the Democratic primary, pushing certain candidates, giving definitely more positive coverage to certain candidates, and giving more speaking time to certain candidates that's disproportionate to really their market share in the polling. It's very difficult to come away with any conclusion other than, no, there's a clear bias against progressives, and generally not political outsiders, because Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are far from that, but people, outsiders in terms of the ideas that they bring and their attempts to shake up the establishment. And that the media will definitely give favorable coverage and more coverage to those who don't attempt to rock the boat in terms of how power is distributed and curated in Washington. So the thing about the parallel people try and draw between Corbyn and Sanders is that it revolves entirely around left politics, and we just talked about that. But a more compelling parallel would really be between Jeremy Corbyn and Hillary Clinton in 2016. Two very different candidates in terms of their politics, but the factors that caused them to lose, those are very similar. Key campaigning errors, regardless of whose fault it was, key structural flaws in the campaign. The Clinton campaign opting not to move to mobilize certain voter bases, not to campaign in certain states where they needed crucial votes. Similar to Corbyn's, I guess, inability to take a strong stance on Brexit, which really led his Labour campaign to look very, very disoriented. And then also in terms of smear campaigns, in Hillary Clinton's case, it wasn't run by the media specifically, though certain media certainly were complicit, but rather simply an opposition party, which the Conservative Party absolutely did consistently try to smear Corbyn as an anti-Semite. And similarly, the Republican Party, with 2 years of Benghazi hearings, a complete nothing burger on emails, and the substance basically essentially taking a tiny bit of substance. There is a valid structural argument about on the what it says about. We'll be right back. So, as I was saying, there actually is a more effective parallel between, or rather a more compelling parallel between Jeremy Corbyn and Hillary Clinton in 2016. Really, the main problems with Jeremy Corbyn's campaign were not the left politics or the pro-working class rhetoric, which was actually echoed in a very hollow manner by the Tories and by Boris Johnson. And that's what the Conservatives do, is that what the center doesn't get in America is that the way that the Tories won was they consistently pretended to be for the working man, and which is exactly what Trump did. Of course, it was reflect populist rhetoric, and so while Hillary Clinton was not of the left, she was also plagued by severe campaigning flaws in terms of not campaigning in key states trying to mobilize voters, instead trying to play this like win over the center strategy, lost partly due to very, very, very limited mobilization, but secondarily, a very coordinated smear campaign in her opposition, which definitely reflects the way that the Conservatives dealt with Jeremy Corbyn, consistently trying to paint him as an anti-Semite. And there were every now and then optics issues, probably once or twice, optics issues in the people that Jeremy Corbyn may have associated with, or at one point spoke highly of someone who had a problematic statement in their past. And there were valid criticisms of basically saying, Corbyn didn't necessarily think of the optics of this. And then the substance in that tiny, not even accusation, but just a minor criticism of a single action was basically exploded into basically the same thing that the American evangelical right does, which is take any minorly problematic substantive behavior associated with an overall structural criticism of the Israeli far right, and turn that into, and then use that as a confirmation, as confirmation evidence to corroborate the idea that this person is an anti-Semite. And that's exactly what the right did to Jeremy Corbyn. This is precisely what the right did to Hillary Clinton over Benghazi and the emails controversy. There definitely was some level of minor government misconduct in the way that Clinton's Department of State handled the use of official emails and the private email server, that there was a minor bit of substance there that was probably subject to criticism and probably structural reform. These aren't things that any Secretary of State has probably done differently in the information era. It was just that Clinton took the fall for it. And so there were probably good criticisms of, this is the way the system is and we need to reform the system. But what Republicans did was they turned it into a corruption allegation on Hillary Clinton. And because there was a tiny bit of substance there to the overall critique, all of the baseless allegations that were leveled at her over the 3 years leading up to the election, Benghazi, even the conspiracy theories, the Pizzagate stuff, the Seth Rich stuff, all of this stuff, even though all of it was baseless and consistently leveled at her maliciously, all of that piled on, it created some level of a bias against her that, like, oh, she's constantly surrounded by scandal. And the moment something with any level of substance stuck, all of it did the damage. Similar thing happened to Corbyn. So the real takeaways from this are, A, there is a very, very strong establishment bias against Jeremy Corbyn specifically, that is only compounded by the Tories' malice for him. And also combining that with what happened to Hillary in 2016, we should know that literally anybody who does not represent the far right or coalesce with the far right is going to be a target of the far right. They will destroy and attack and smear anybody who dares challenge their power. It doesn't matter whether it's a socialist, a social democrat, or a neoliberal. They will paint everyone as, a sickle and hammer toting pinko crazy Stalinist. So it's time to stop worrying about how the right is going to react to somebody who actually echoes the principles of social democracy. That's a ridiculous attacking point that that candidate would be more subject to attack. These are people who don't care how far to the left of them you are. As long as you are, pro-choice, anti-locking kids up in camps, you're probably going to be in their crosshairs. And then I guess the last takeaway, really is that we just need to have coordinated campaigns. The one parallel I would say that does exist with the potential for abuse is abuse by the right in America, is that if the big difference between the UK elections and the American elections. And this was one I heard on the Majority Report, I believe. Jamie Peck made this analysis, and I agreed with it largely, which was Brexit completely fragmented the center, the left, and the far left. The center, left, and the left, as we would refer to it. Basically, you had the center, which was completely anti-Brexit, essentially. Or the center-left was completely anti-Brexit. The center was hard against any kind of pro-worker reforms. The far left didn't really care about Brexit, but cared more about solving the material conditions that led to it. They cared about making Brexit obsolete, but there was no effective campaign to run against it because Brexit was the taste of the season. So the inability of the left to form a comprehensive coalition against or for something, everybody was a part of whatever coalition they were part of for a different reason. So Brexit completely shattered the unity of the left, which created a huge, just a huge power concentration in the right, which had one message, which was get out of the EU. Get out of the EU. The EU is screwing workers. Get out of the EU. It was a complete lie. Everything they said was a complete lie. But they said it as one, and the more people say it, the more people sound like they're corroborating it, and the more true it sounds. That's what the right did effectively, and that's why the UK elections were a monumental failure. The difference between that and the US is that Trump has a certain uniting factor to him. Trump essentially has created a caricature of everything that led to him that unites people who would never ordinarily support even an Elizabeth Warren. There are people coming out of the woodwork who would vote for her as an anti-Trump protest. Essentially, Trump is kind of the Hillary of 2020. Is that, like, so many people voted for him because they just hated Hillary Clinton. The validity of their reasons notwithstanding, that there were probably valid reasons to dislike her, but those who voted for Trump over her probably didn't have any of them. So when Trump was elected, he basically created a single unifying point for the entire center, left, and left. And that exists and will persist through 2020. And the one thing we do know is that the center left will vote against Trump no matter what. You can definitely count on the center left to turn out and vote for whoever is the Democratic nominee, which creates a much lower risk factor when it comes to the prospects of nominating a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren, both of whom are progressives to different extents, but more importantly, both of whom present a real, at least signal a real threat to the people in power. I actually work in the financial district, and one thing I hear every single day is the statement that Elizabeth Warren is an anti-capitalist. Well, different varying structures of that statement. That's the most extreme form of it I've heard. But every day I hear people complaining about how Elizabeth Warren is, like, such a threat to them. And ultimately, we can have reasonable disagreements as to how big of a threat she poses. But the truth is that, like, she definitely represents a change in the political discourse. And, of course, the mistake they make is nobody talks about Bernie Sanders, but Bernie Sanders is gaining in the polls. He's continuing to climb. And he's in a steady second place nationally, continuing to rise, gaining first in several polls state by state. And once he's in the contention, you can expect to see people start coming out of the woodwork trying to slam him. But once he's the nominee, you're going to see a lot of people just say, okay, we got to fall in line because we just got to get Trump out. These are people, of course, who think that being against Trump is an effective or acceptable substitute for a political personality. But as long as they vote for my guy, I'm good. So now we're going to get to probably the most important topic of the week, which is, who am I? So I'll probably do like a real in-depth introduction to my political background, because I think it's interesting for people who might come from similar backgrounds to know how I got to where I am. That'll happen sometime in the future, if it does. But the quick end of it is, I am what you would call a liberal. Even people on the left who use liberal disparagingly, yes, that's how I would refer to myself. I've had long-time progressive leanings that stem from a European raised childhood. I grew up in I grew up in a social democracy, not quite so Scandinavian as Scandinavia, but in Western Europe, where, you know, collective bargaining was a fact of life, where healthcare was guaranteed to every person. And these are things that I've taken for granted. The only conflict that I had was, I always had something of a neoliberal political praxis, where I was the word pragmatic was ingrained in my personality. And I was always very hesitant, very much about, discourse, saying we have to convince the other side of our argument. We have to have incremental changes. I agree with what you want, but we have to have a better approach to getting it. And then all of those views were turned on their head by the 2016 election. And then after the 2016 election, we saw the rise of progressive politics in various areas in New York, Massachusetts, and in Michigan, Minnesota, the Midwest, the East Coast, all over. And then also the rising tide of the global far right through various online and offline networks. We saw a far right faction in India that long preceded the rise of Trump, from all the way back in 2014. And that was already a signal to the world of what was about to happen. And then Brexit happened in 2016, right before Trump was elected. So the global far right obviously did not begin with Trump and has not ended with him either. So this was where I really started to become disillusioned with neoliberalism. I started to realize that my way of looking at how to accomplish stuff wasn't working in the current power structure, and there was not really any forward movement toward like an economy that really addresses the needs of the most vulnerable people. And the other issue I had was that it seemed that those in power, even on my side of the political aisle, were very complacent with the political oligarchy, which was clear. There was a study that was released also, I think, in the year 2017 that said clearly the U.S. is no longer a democracy. It is an effective corporate oligarchy. And I started to see, like the way power in the U.S. consistently exploits workers and bodies of color. I started to understand the criminal justice system, how it skirts the minimum wage in order to exploit workers. And I could not fathom a world in which I was engaging in any kind of course of political action that was enabling this, or or failing to challenge this effectively. So I came to support a slightly more hands-on approach to restructuring power in my country. I decided to add my voice to the fray for a few reasons. First, I still am what you would describe as a liberal at heart. I believe in free discourse, free speech, civil liberties, and open discussion of ideas. But what I have kind of integrated with those views is that those values have to be informed by a baseline ideology of justice, and understanding what justice is, to whom it applies, and to whom we have a responsibility to provide it. And this, I think, is the greatest failure of that neoliberalism that I left some months or years ago. Neoliberalism has no commitment to justice. ultimately its entire ideological loyalty is to the American political process. This idea of discourse, statesmanship, of compromise and bargaining. And the problem with this process is that it relies on an opposing side that is also dedicated to that process, that won't cut corners and cheat, lie, and prevaricate their way into gaining power over you and then using that power to stunt you at every given opportunity, which that kind of honor doesn't exist in the Republican Party. And we can't ever trust it to exist in a right-wing faction, because the right is so extremely obsessed with gaining power and expanding their own ability to exert control and exploit people more vulnerable than them. So this was my problem, was neoliberalism constantly conceding to status quo. It was not translating to any kind of justice, and the liberals that I had until then come to admire were doing very little to nothing to actually help achieve justice outcomes. And not only that, once the progressives that kind of shook my worldview were nominated, beating out veteran Democrats, establishment Democrats, they were getting attacked from the center by other members of their party. And that was the moment where I was like, if neoliberalism is about incremental change, why aren't they for an increase in the progressive voice within their party? And so now I continue to wonder, whether the majority of neoliberals genuinely believe that respecting process will eventually lead to justice, or are simply playing naive to protect their own political power. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And those both seem like possibilities. And I'm sure one applies to some, one applies to others. But at the end of the day, the reality is that the failure of the center and the center left in America has been severely exploited by a very, very, very malicious group of actors, led by the odious, disgusting Mitch McConnell, who is the Senate Majority Leader and the worst person possibly in the world, as well as various Republican demagogues and ideologues who just continue to expand their own power. They will lie, they will cheat, they will exploit, and they will abduct in order to do it. They do it to immigrants at the border, and they do it to black bodies in prisons. They regularly engage the prison state and the police state in order to further the interests of their own political allies and financial benefactors. So it's time to stop trusting that process by itself. We need to have an ideology again. It's time to remerge class, race, and gender liberation back into a narrative on achieving true liberty in society. Because I do believe in liberty, but liberty includes financial liberty, socioeconomic liberty, race liberty, gender liberation. These are not dispensable parts of the liberty narrative. The second reason I got into this is, honestly, I wanted to see more left figures who look like me. I was watching an episode of The Majority Report with Sam Seder, and a caller called in and said, "Why don't you have more black women on?" And Sam Seder said, "We should have more black women on. In fact, I would love to see more people who don't look like me." I would like to point out for the record, in case anybody was confused or was having trouble or is one of those I don't see race or gender people, I am not a black woman, and I agree wholly with that we need more underrepresented groups. But I am somebody that I don't really see many people who look like me in on this side of the political aisle. I'm seeing more and more, but the people that I do see, there are plenty of brown male-presenting commentators, but most of them are like pretty far to the right of me or very far to the left of me. And certainly no hate toward any of the brown socialists out there, but I personally approach left politics, but from a slightly more liberal perspective and different frame. So I thought maybe I can reach out to a different kind of audience. So That's kind of where I'm coming from. Ideologically, the best description for me is that I'm a social democrat. I generally like the effectiveness of capitalism in creating predictable human behavior, and it directs human behavior in a direction where we can see where it's going, and that I think is the strongest defense of capitalism. But on that hand, I support rigorous regulation to correct for bad actors and market failures, because the whole point of capitalism is that and free markets is that they create predictable human behavior, but that behavior isn't necessarily good. It's not always good. It's not even majority good. So anytime you have predictably bad actions, we have a ethical responsibility to correct for it via government action. That said, I have no underlying loyalty to capitalism. So if my political worldview leads to like a viable and sustainable Marxist model, I'm totally fine with that. If not, I'm also fine with that. What I care about is that the end product is a free and just society. I'm in favor of any system that achieves that, period. So I hit on this before, and my primary goal with, I guess, this content and any political views that I espouse are to remarry like this liberal worldview with a clear, unwavering moral commitment, and the only way to do that is through left politics. And that's why I support Bernie Sanders for president in 2020, if it wasn't already obvious. And people come up to me and they're like, hey, you're pretty liberal. You have like a college background, college educated. Elizabeth Warren seems like your candidate. Why don't you support Elizabeth Warren? And I tell them, I do. I do support Elizabeth Warren, and there's a little asterisk there in the script because there are very, very clear reasons that I support Bernie Sanders. Far, it's not even close. I like Warren as a candidate, and if Bernie didn't exist, I would be very, very passionate about Elizabeth Warren. But Bernie Sanders and his coalition do exist, and it is the most important political movement, I think, of my lifetime. So I'm going to get into the reasons that Bernie Sanders is a better candidate for president by far. And this is despite the fact that I think Senator Warren is probably close to, in a vacuum, she's probably close to my ideal candidate, very, very qualified, long time accomplishments profile, a long record of getting things done in the Senate, co-created the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and I just like someone who gets corrupt bankers fired. So I really do like Elizabeth Warren. But the reason I support Bernie Sanders is multifold. First off, the things I like about Warren are also her problems as a candidate. Some of them. She presents herself as what you would call a reform technocrat. She is someone who definitely believes that government should be by the qualified elite. That you should have qualified people in charge of government, which sounds great on the surface, and I support it in theory as well. If anything, that bias is confirmed by a bumbling buffoon in the presidency. That's probably good to have qualified people in charge. But this is also an era where power is self-curated, that the people who hold the political power are also the ones deciding who holds the political power. So they're curating the power and then they're delegating it as well. So basically, special interests, corrupting financial influence, these things reign very legally but very corruptly in a very broken system. So people in decision-making circles, they've defined expertise per their own credentials. And this isn't malicious. It's natural to be biased towards systems in which we personally have succeeded and found meaning. I don't imagine that people like Henry Kissinger and Charles Koch consider themselves to be evil people, let alone someone in Washington significantly more removed from moral crimes. I specifically chose those two because they are complicit historically in mass murder and mass exploitation, respectively. But the point is that when everyone in power talks and thinks like you, it's very easy to rationalize your choices, to rationalize your actions. And it stands to reason that you're the one who deserves the power, and that your actions with the power and to get the power are justified. So once you're convinced of your claim, you can justify anything you have to do to keep it. So this is just the natural progression of human corruption. It's not with conspiracy, and oftentimes it's not even with malice. But the only solution to these corrupted power structures is to reestablish accountability via democracy. In our politics, in our economy, and in our social foundations, what we need is leaders to be accountable to the people that they represent. And that's the point of lower levels of government. It needs to be close. Every lower level of government needs to be closer to the people, a more accurate representation of the average person. I agree with a certain level of elitism in certain levels of government, that there are qualifications we should enforce. But those qualifications can also be defined a little more broadly. But when it comes to the lower levels of government, by lower I mean closer to the people, more close representation. The more constituents you have, the higher up in government you are, definitionally. And you see this, you even see this understanding, this kind of pedantry in the way that parliaments are named. In the UK, you have the House of Commons versus the House of Lords. There's a clear designation difference. And the House of Commons is individuals representing smaller constituencies, and the House of Lords is a bunch of appointed aristocrats. And then you see the same thing in India, where Lok Sabha, which means the People's Assembly, is the more diverse and larger assembly, and then Rajya Sabha is the state assembly. Of course, this is modeled directly after the UK Parliament. So even in parliamentary nomenclature, you're seeing these designations about there is an element of populism that is designed with an element of, in the case of parliament, it's clear aristocracy and borderline monarchy. But then once you get to the Senate in the U.S., you can maintain that idea of the Commons, of the People's House. And that's what the House of Representatives should be. Representatives has that connotation to it, but it's a little bit more removed. So since that nomenclature gets lost in our parliamentary systems, we forget that that's what the design is. The constituencies are smaller so that people can be more accountable to their reps, or to the people they represent. And somehow we've moved past that, where you're seeing constant career politicians dominate the House floor. And even the people who come from other careers, they don't come from like the average American, right? Each of the 435 members of Congress of the House of Representatives, when I say Congress, is meant to represent a very specific and concentrated walk of American life that is encapsulated in their district. Of course, gerrymandering has kind of changed this, but that notwithstanding. So this is what's so significant about someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, with a very, very real and powerful class struggle in her young adulthood that immediately precedes her election to Congress. That she was a bartender. She worked for minimum wage in the north of Manhattan, up in the Bronx, wherever she worked. Not in affluent neighborhoods. She represents a very, very real American experience, a very gritty and difficult, struggle-filled American experience. And then you have representatives like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and Ayanna Pressley, who are career politicians for sure, but they also have incredible working class roots, and that informs the fervor of their advocacy. So that's the kind of beating heart to progressive change you want to see. Not someone like, obviously, you've got a bunch of career politicians who really you don't know them before their entry into politics. So that's kind of where we are right now, right? You've got this right wing that's represented by people like Jim Jordan and Devin Nunes, and to the extent that they were not politicians, they were very, very exploitive, like either business owners or members of extremely problematic academic systems. I encourage you to look into Jim Jordan's past if you haven't. So while Elizabeth Warren works toward many of the positive changes that we seek to see on behalf of the working class, she doesn't nurture the democratic staying power that you see really, really fuel progressive movement in Congress. Bernie does. Bernie absolutely does do that. So Warren's trying to promote herself as the good technocrat. She's a well-wishing elite who would fight for the common folk in any way she can. But what she what she overestimates is her individual power in a city full of elites who aren't as benevolent as her, or well-meaning as her either. That's literally exactly the same thing. So, synonyms. So the problem with Warren is that without a fierce democratic coalition that crosses racial, gender, class, and academic lines, because a postgraduate degree is not a substitute for the unparalleled diversity of human experience, that there are plenty of ways to build understanding of the world, intelligence, and smarts that don't involve a college diploma or a postgraduate diploma. And also, there are plenty of ways to get a degree and come out being really, really, really stupid. That there's plenty of examples of really stupid people with very, very high academic qualifications. So without that coalition, what kind of looks like it might happen is a repeat of the Obama administration, except without even the progressive grassroots coalition that Obama had. He had that grassroots staying power that won him actually the nomination. And once he, with the help of Organizing for America, got into the White House, on day one he threw it away. And the OFA experiment was done. He didn't take it with him. He didn't continue the experiment. Bernie would continue that experiment. Warren isn't even pretending to cultivate it. And I understand her type. I understand what kind of voter she's trying to appeal to and what kind of voter bloc she's trying to appeal to increase her market share. Market share as in like her voter share in the polls. But Bernie Sanders is committed to the cause of collective democratic action. And he knows that democratic action and overturning every level of government with fierce populist power is the best and might be the only solution to the self-corruption of elite power. And this is the importance of the Not Me, Us movement. I also want to get to another compelling criticism. I also want to get to another compelling criticism of Bernie Sanders and what is considered a strike in favor of Elizabeth Warren, which is that Bernie Sanders has been less effective than Elizabeth Warren of affecting policy change in their respective careers, notwithstanding the validity of these claims. Obviously, Warren has definitely has a more salient track record, at least over the past like 5 or 6 years. But that touches into, I think, a mentality flaw in terms of the way that liberals think about what the presidency does, what it represents, and how we're supposed to look at it. Obviously, there's a baseline of, if you're going to be president, you have to have some level of structural competence. And you have to be able to not let the house burn down. But one thing we've learned from Trump is that while his presidency is a disaster and it's causing serious damage to our country, the country still exists. The structure still exists. The structures still exist. And our bureaucracies still exist. Our processes still exist. He has not destroyed anything in terms of the foundations of American democracy yet. Obviously, he has a Supreme Court that is radically reshaped and is going to continue to reshape the landscape of American politics. And I think the changes to our judicial branch are probably the most permanent and damaging that have ever been done. But of course, that's not even an administrative competence issue. That's an ideological issue. Is that we let somebody that radical as Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell to have complete control over who owns the judicial branch. But in terms of qualifications, I think you need a baseline to like keep the house going. But beyond that, designing effective policy is not that's not the primary function of the president. It's a great function, but there are plenty of ways to have playmakers who are able to create, affect, and institute change. The job of a president is to establish and shape discourse, and that's the primary distinction between Warren and Sanders, and their pitches, respectively, is that Warren has a plan. Sanders has a vision, and he cares about establishing a real moral narrative, and that's the president's primary function, especially in this era. Drive the narrative, establish a vision, and influence national discourse. When messaging was clear and moral, the country always thrived. One thing Trump does really well is that he shapes national discourse, and he does it to devastating effect. Everything he talks about is wrong and terrible, but because he talks about it, it becomes a focus of attention. And he knows that negative media coverage, or his coalition at least knows that negative media coverage is not going to affect the policies that they institute. So as long as the media is focused on terrible things that they can't change, the attention is off the terrible things that we should be protesting. And so he abuses national discourse to devastating effect. But other presidents have done exactly this to greater goods. So the best example is Roosevelt, who had this incredible all-encompassing vision of social democracy. And that was expressed in spirit and law by the New Deal, the establishment of the FDIC, sweeping financial regulations that combined into the most comprehensive expansion of the middle class, of public accountability for private financial institutions, and all of that policy came from him and his Democratic Party, yes, but it started with a very real vision of what America could be and what America could become. And this was continued by Kennedy when he established senior care Medicare. And that was the beginning of America's left experiment in a national healthcare system. And Medicare went on to become the most successful and effective health insurance provider in the country. But JFK's intent was always to expand Medicare to all Americans. That was crystal clear in his rhetoric. And he said it was never designed to be limited to seniors. It was supposed to begin by guaranteeing affordable coverage to those who needed it most, to prove that it could be done. And that principle was expanded by LBJ, who, shortly after his death, signed into law the creation of Medicaid. And that was passed by the Democratic Party over which JFK had presided. It would be a grave mistake to presume that presidents' effect on national discourse is tethered to their ability to immediately affect policy. What else did JFK talk about? He had a mission statement to put a man on the moon. He didn't have a plan to pay for it. He didn't have a 42-step plan to put a man on, wherever. He said, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And Project Apollo was a consistent and monumental failure through the end of his life and beyond. But his ardent support for the pursuit of space exploration and the ambition with which he presented it to the American people, it inspired not only the eventual success of Apollo 11, but it gave way to multiple generations of scientists, engineers, and inventors who developed technologies like which we could never have imagined. Never, ever, ever. Out of World War II, which already was a technological revolution, to say, hey, what we just did, we could do that from our smartphones in 70 years. You'd laugh me out of the room. The point of this is that ambition has always been the cornerstone of American progress. You don't start by presenting a budget proposal. You start by defining the moral and visionary backbone of the experiment that you're running. In this case, this is the American experiment, where Kennedy and Roosevelt alike said, we have an obligation to create a social safety net for all Americans. And they did that. And they defined the American experiment to something that works to the benefit of all people, not just to the benefit of the rich, to millionaires and billionaires with the money and power to buy financial, economic, and political capital, while continuing to exploit labor using disproportionately accumulated power. And also not just to the benefit of, white, straight, cis men, but to the benefit of everyone. And not just to the benefit of those within our borders or just with a bald eagle on their passports. I'm talking everybody. And that brings me to my next point over why I definitively and explicitly support Bernie Sanders over Elizabeth Warren. It is time to get serious on foreign policy. Moving beyond the basic, simplistic, anti-interventionist rhetoric of, your average libertarian or Tulsi Gabbard supporter, what I care about is a comprehensive doctrine of global solidarity. And we can inject that into existing systems to start actively working against global imperialism and against the global far right. Because not only the US is perpetuating that, but our rivals are too. So even while we work within realistic structures where we have to compete in a global economy, we can start talking about basic moral fiber, about how to treat people in our country and in others in the way that we deal with the world. So it is long past due for us to start undermining global empire in any way we can. And this is only accentuated by the continuing rise and mutual enablement of the global far right. You've got Trump, you've got the alt-right, you've got UKIP, you've got left-leaning experiments that are under attack in the EU, in South America, Likud, and Bolsonaro, and BJP in India, and every tribalist faction in between. We are facing a legitimate domino effect. Except this time we're in an age where, because of the internet, every domino is connected to every other domino via every kind of online network. So what we need is solidarity with social democratic experiments, such as Rojava, such as Lula in Brazil. These are people who are trying to protect the vulnerable from right-wing populism and advocate for solving the issues that actually led to it in the first place. So we have to defeat domestic corporatists who support Bolsonaro while he ravages Brazil's indigenous population and sets fire to our global ecology. I'm looking directly at the Wall Street Journal. It also includes solidarity with Kashmir, which lies between two authoritarian political regimes, north and south. And they're locked in a 70-year-long religious conflict. And we're going to talk about one of those regimes later. But both of those regimes are posturing and escalating toward a war that can preempt climate change as the greatest global disaster facing humanity. If India and Pakistan go to war, that is not going to be a war limited to just them. This is global interconnectivity, and we need to start fighting for what is right. Bernie Sanders is the only candidate by a long shot who embodies such a necessary ideal. And I can absolutely fall in line with Elizabeth Warren on domestic issues, given the right Democratic coalition, but I cannot align on this. Elizabeth Warren represents politics as usual when it comes to foreign policy, and if she has the nomination, I will constantly fight to push her to the left, and I will be very much in support of her on domestic policy. But when it comes to establishing a basic starting doctrine of we care about justice in the world, it's time to get serious, and it's time to elect Bernie Sanders. So it's time to fight for the right change before change visits us uninvited in the form of global disaster. And that could be through war, it could be through fascism, or it could simply be through the fire our species continues to set to our own home. But whatever the case, it is time to change. So that's clear and transparent, my intents and my rationale laid completely bare. We're going to fight to elect Bernie Sanders. We're going to fight to empower the Not Me Us movement, which is the most important political movement probably of the modern era. And we're going to form a progressive coalition that backs a progressive leader. So with that, here's what I'll do with this platform to accomplish those ends. I will make honest arguments, and I will say things that I believe are factual and moral. I will welcome and respond to constructive critique of both my arguments and philosophy. I will be honest about what I'm fighting for, about what cause I'm fighting for, and I will be accountable to my justifications, like you just saw. And I will criticize people who make arguments that are false or misleading, who are trying to undermine the cause I'm fighting for. What I won't do is I won't be an aimless fact checker. If someone I share ideology with makes a bad argument, I'm not going to make that argument, but I'm not going to go out of my way to correct it. I don't care for infighting. I don't care for fragmented discussion. I have justified my cause rationally and empirically and ethically. So I'm not going to undermine my own cause to prove my loyalty to the overarching truth. I've proven that. I've done that labor. So fact checks, infighting, without any ethical justification, asinine, pointless to me. I don't care. That said, one of my primary causes is to protect the vulnerable among us from all forms of attack. So I will never condone any kind of socially harmful tactics, even among the left, that can be used to justify bigotry against others. This includes, by the way, homophobia against gay candidates I may disagree with, and body shaming authoritarians who don't have a normal body type. You can fill in the blanks. I don't condone it, and I won't have it on my platform. And the final thing that I will never do is I will never, ever, ever clickbait my content with overtly sensational intros or titles that reduce a complex, nuanced argument into a quippy, on-the-nose soundbite. On that note, Pete Buttigieg stinks. I'm going to take a quick break, and after that, we're going to get into that. So stay tuned. And I'm back. That was a real quick break, but just a little bit more to go, and we're going to get out of here. Just going to read a chat. Shout out to ManXMud in chat, who compliments my music. That is an original piece that I got an A for in my MIDI class. So before I went to break, I teased our next topic. There's been a lot of uproar among progressive circles over Pete Buttigieg. Now, what I do want to say is there's a lot of tribalism among the left. Basically, everything defers to supporting Bernie, getting Bernie elected. And there's a certain Bernie or bust sentiment among the left that I don't agree with, but I'm not ready to take on because I think it is extremely important to elect Bernie Sanders. So I understand what that tribalism is about. I also understand that the viciousness of the attacks, especially from like the Bernie side of YouTube, can sometimes put off the less aggressive kind of progressive who's trying to really understand candidates on their merits. And one thing Pete Buttigieg does really well is he masks a lot of very run-of-the-mill, milquetoast centrist views in progressive rhetoric. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about the overall sense of Buttigieg's platform, his pitch to the people, and his rhetoric as well. So I unironically believe I would rather have Joe Biden than Pete Buttigieg as the nominee. And that's not just because he has a better chance in the general, which he does. It may come as a surprise because of the tones of their campaigns, how different the things they purport to stand for, and their support bases. But there is a value to saying, to me, there's a value of having a genuine regressive over somebody who sinisterly undermines progressive politics and really gives progressivism a bad name. Buttigieg entered the race calling criticisms of Medicare for All Republican talking points. He's known for penning an essay in which he compliments Bernie Sanders on being willfully unapologetically progressive. He entered the presidential race as a progressive, pro Medicare for all, you know, anti police brutality, despite a very, very disturbing allegations against him in South Bend, and pro education reform. Everything you can think of, pro worker. This is how he signaled. From what I can tell, and this is largely a guess, an educated guess, once he discovered there was really no share in the polls for him running as a progressive, that Bernie and Elizabeth Warren pretty much had that locked up and they had a lot more cred with the voters. Once he realized there was no value in running as a progressive, he just started to move further and further to the center. But the roots of his rhetoric, that stayed the same. His tone stayed the same. And that's what's really scary about Pete Buttigieg. He continues to adopt progressive buzzwords and progressive talking points. But he uses them to advertise not very progressive policy positions. Medicare for all who want it is literally just a public option. And we're going to talk about why public option is a bad idea, why there are better ways to move towards single payer, and why single payer or multi-payer, why a universal nationalized healthcare system of some kind is probably the best move for American politics. We'll talk about that probably on a future podcast. I hope to do one before the end of the year because it's a very interesting topic. But for now, the main thing to note is that the public option is highly ineffective and a serious problem for multiple reasons, including that it does not give the government enough power to negotiate healthcare costs. It forces us to compete with private healthcare providers who have a disproportionate amount of power in the industry, and it's not going to reduce the cost of healthcare. It's still going to force an incredible amount of cost onto consumers, and it doesn't actually provide a premium-free form of healthcare to those who cannot afford premiums, period. So basically, like, to put it kind of gruffly, Medicare for all who want it is just Biden care, but without a boomer face on it. It's spruced up to look like a policy challenge without really any kind of teeth. Buttigieg employs a similar tactic against the free public college option, where he says, why should billionaires get to send their kids to school for free? And of course, any detailed examination of the statement is ridiculous. We don't employ this argument when we give the rich access to public transportation or highways or Social Security or Medicare. We don't do it with the fire department. No one's complaining that the rich shouldn't get access to the fire department. The whole point of giving the rich access to free college is, A, we don't bog down our infrastructure with forms upon forms of means testing. You don't have to apply for to show that you're poor enough to go to a public school. And in addition, there's no status stigma, where if the rich get to send their kids to college for free, there's no concept of like, oh, you go to the poor college. No, this is the public college. And everyone's paying for it. And if I'm going to pay for my kids, if I'm going to pay for your kids to go there, I'm going to send my kids there for free. And I'm going to have a lot more investment into the quality of that system. And also, it's a good idea to have people breaking class lines in their education. That is so important. One of the most important experiences I had as a pretty privileged person was to go to university with a pretty high representation of first-generation college students, of people coming in on scholarships, Rhodes Scholars, people who, I think Anbright Scholars. I worked with an Anbright Scholar who was I think is a scholarship for first-generation college students. And to actually have your experience not completely confirmed and your biases confirmed by being surrounded by people with the same life history as you have. But secondarily, it's just like means testing makes things worse. It makes it harder for people to qualify for things that they need for free college. Imagine having a federal application for fire station assistance, where it's like, oh, your house is on fire. We're going to need you to fill out a FAFSA. We don't do that because means testing consistently proves to be a barrier to access, and it deprives far more assistance to those who need it than gives assistance to those who don't. And when rich people are sending their kids to school, they're not sending them for free. They're the ones paying the taxes. The taxes will be higher, but the difference will be that they're paying the tuition for their own kids. If they don't want to send them there, they don't have to send them there. It's the same as a single-payer healthcare system. Well, we'll get to that. I mean, you can always pay out of pocket. And then there was another really dishonest talking point from Buttigieg, where he said, we talk all the time about college, but what about people without college degrees? What about people who go into non-college trade professions? And that really was transparent as to he's just trying to hit any snide, disgusting, dishonest talking point that he can. But I'm going to let Bernie Sanders actually speak for himself here.
What do you say to that argument that there's no reason to pay for people who've been paid for free?
Well, I say Buttigieg is wrong on both counts. Number one, of course, when we talk about making higher education, public colleges and universities tuition-free, we mean not only college, but we mean trade schools as well. There are millions of good jobs out there in construction and all kinds of areas where people are good at working with their hands. They don't want to go to college. And, of course, we are going to make tuition-free for those people. So what he's saying is not accurate. Second of all, there is the issue of universality. I'm very glad that Mr. Buttigieg is worried that I have been too easy on upper-income people and the millionaires and billionaires, that I'm going to allow their kids to go to public colleges and universities. Just, by the way, as they do go to public schools right now. Trump's kids can go to any public school, elementary school, high school in the country, tuition-free. But the point is, I happen to believe that when you talk about programs like Social Security, like health care, like higher education, they should be universal. The way you pay for them, and the way I do it, not the way Buttigieg does it, is I do demand that at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, that the very rich will start paying their fair share of taxes, as will corporate America. You pay for it by raising revenue from the very rich, but then you say in a very simple way that any person who wants a higher education, college, trade school should be able to do it. You know, right now, that's what we do with Social Security. It is a popular program. It is a universal program.
So, yeah, I mean, there it is. Clear as day, just complete. And this is the thing about Bernie Sanders, that he talks with such clarity and he says, no, this is exactly why he's wrong, and I'm going to say it. And I can all but guarantee that Elizabeth Warren, all things neutral, would absolutely co-sign that statement. Warren also supports free college. She would say, of course we're going to send people to trade schools and vocational schools. That's the whole point of this initiative. The whole point of this initiative is to lift people out of poverty. So this tactic of trying to attack Sanders from the left, it's obviously not going to work. And it's only going to appeal to people who weren't predisposed to vote for Bernie Sanders anyway. But I can only hope that constantly showing people, especially people from my kind of background, who don't necessarily like the populist tone of Sanders' rhetoric, will eventually see that, like, this is what Bernie Sanders is about. Pete Buttigieg does not represent the progressive values of today's left. He doesn't have a background in democratic action, and what political record he has is murky at best, especially when it comes to advocating for people who don't come from his level of privilege. But he continues to appropriate progressive vocabulary while consistently trying to belittle progressive proposals. At best, this tactic is misguided pragmatism, and to see it that way requires an astronomically charitable reading of Buttigieg's arguments. And at worst, he's a corporate Trojan horse protecting the Zuckerbergs of the world while trying to make us believe he cares about anything. most likely it's a medium where he's a centrist, he's a concerned troll from the center who very much could do lasting damage to the progressive cause by associating his own ineffective neoliberal brand with the progressive rhetoric he continues to appropriate. When he talks about Medicare for all who want it, and then if he were to be elected and institute a public option and that fails, the word Medicare for all would permanently be associated with the failed healthcare system that he instituted. And that's very, very, very dangerous, and that does lasting damage to the progressive brand. If Biden is nominated and he's elected, and his presidency is the same disaster that got us here, the left can clearly distinguish itself from him. And we can make another case. We can say, see, we told you not to nominate Biden. We told you not to nominate Biden. And if Biden loses to Trump, which every decent person hopes he doesn't, I hope whoever the Democratic nominee is beats Trump, and I will vote for whoever the Democratic nominee is, obviously. But if Biden were to lose to Trump, a very meager consolation prize would be that our fears about running another status quo candidate, especially someone who's a little bit concerning in his demeanor, as Biden is, that those fears would be vindicated. Not worth it, obviously, but at least we would know, yeah, maybe I was a little bit right there. And so we can do that because Biden is sincere in his centrism. And I respect that. I actually do respect that. Now, Buttigieg, first off, he gets creamed in a general. I don't understand Buttigieg gets destroyed in a general versus Trump via black turnout alone. You can't run a Democratic candidate with zero black support. It's a losing formula. And when he loses, he's uniquely placed to bring down both the center and the left with him, because there's so many people who believe he's from both. As a candidate, he would represent the left to anyone who's not of the left. And he would also represent the center. That's very, 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 just very concerning. So the point is, don't vote for Pete Buttigieg. If you want a centrist, vote for Biden. Biden is the strongest center candidate against Trump, and he's also leading the polls right now. If you want a centrist, vote for Biden. You shouldn't want a centrist. Centrists are what got us to Trump in the first place. And if you want someone who's not quite so radical as Bernie, I also still disagree with you, but I understand where you're coming from because I come from that place as well. You should vote for Elizabeth Warren. If you want the best candidate for the job, who will change the narrative, who will reshape dialogue in this country, and who will actually move us toward a political system that solves the material issues of the people who voted for Trump out of frustration, then it's time to elect Bernie Sanders. So we're going to get into the final topic, I think, for the day. I was going to tease some other stuff, but we don't really have time. Actually, I've gone much longer than I expected to. So part of the reason that I joined the political YouTube sphere was that I want to bridge kind of these Indian roots that I have with the American political consciousness, because I think that there's a real problem with, especially within my communities, of very progressive non-residential Indians. So Indians who moved from India over here, who support Democrats and progressive policies and liberals here, but then go back and they're very much pro-Modi and pro-BJP. Because I'm from a privileged caste Hindu family. And that really bothers me. And I think it's time to understand that left politics includes building real global solidarity that includes every other country. And it's the other reason I got into it was that it's very easy because of that for me to care about Indian politics and what's going on. Because many of my family and friends are also Indian. And from there, inductively, I have the privilege of being able to say that I care about my country, and I also care about this country that's not really mine, but I have a stake in it. And from there, I can start building like a doctrine of foreign policy ethics. I think that's difficult for people who aren't necessarily from immigrant families, because it's weird, because this is the one country that you've ever really known as home. There's no real links to other countries, and it's difficult to get outside of the border and start thinking about foreign policy, but all of that comes back to affect us, and it is extremely important. So it's very good to be in the know about what's going on in the world and to have opinions on it and to be understanding how we have an influence on that and what our responsibility is to the international discourse. So even if you're not South Asian or Hindu or Muslim, I strongly advise you to stick around for this last segment, because it's part of building an understanding that there's an entire world out there, and our actions here are the most powerful and far-reaching influence in what happens out there. And what happens out there comes back to hit us. And we've learned that in the past. It's time to start caring beyond our own borders. So this is the one more news story I'm going to do from the past couple weeks. There's two big news stories coming out of India these past couple of weeks, which is the Citizenship Amendment Bill, and also the court decision to uphold the building of the Ayodhya temple, the temple in Ayodhya where the Babri Masjid once stood, which was the mosque that was torn down in 1992. So the Citizenship Amendment Bill, in a nutshell, basically there are India's census is riddled with administrative problems, because there's a lot of bureaucratic problems in the basic structures of Indian admin. So there's a lot of people living in, especially in Northeast India, undocumented, because they have not been counted in the census in forever. And so what the Citizenship Amendment Bill does, or people call it CAB or CAB, what it does is it creates a path to citizenship for everyone living in India who has not yet been counted as a citizen. It gives them the ability to attain citizenship, with one caveat. If that person identifies as a Muslim, they are not allowed to seek citizenship. It really baffles me. I really thought, I didn't, but I'd hoped that this would be the breaking point, where people who insist that the Indian right is not Islamophobic would turn around and they would say, okay, you know what, I was wrong. And there are some centrists who have done that. But largely, what it was are people who insisted that they weren't Islamophobic essentially coming out and admitting they are. And they do it through various different kinds of rhetoric. They come out and say, you know, the world has so many different Muslim countries, why can't we have a Hindu nation? By the way, if this sounds familiar, it's because it's reflected by Richard Spencer and the white nationalist movement. Israel is a Jewish ethno-state, says renowned and now explicitly understood anti-Semite Richard Spencer. He says, Israel is an ethno-state, why can't we have our own? And this is a common talking point. And first off, it's the idea that one person having their own ethno-state justifies us having ours. I disagree with the concept of an ethno-state. I think that we need to have a society, a global society that moves towards generally abolishing borders, if not like legal borders, needs to move toward abolishing borders based on religion, race, ethnicity. So no, I don't agree with other countries being ethno-states. But secondarily, you're talking about a giant secular experiment in India that is being supplanted by a faction that has existed since before the country's founding. And so these are the facts of CAB, is that it provides a path to citizenship. If you're Muslim, you do not qualify. That is clear anti-Muslim legislation. 100%. And the rhetoric used to defend it always dances around the topic. One of the really disingenuous points is Hindu nationalists will hear you say A path to citizenship bill that excludes Muslims is not okay, is not just. And the Hindu nationalists will say to you, oh, so you're saying that undocumented immigrants shouldn't get a path to citizenship? And it's a clear, they're trying to attack you from the left. And it's a clear obfuscation. But it derails the narrative, right? So don't get thrown off. Do not let people push you down dialogue trees. The other narrative people will say is that, like, oh, your side was led by an Italian Christian, so why do you tell Hindus what to do with our country? Do not grant the premise that India is a Hindu nation. It is not. Pakistan was created as a Muslim nation out of fear of persecution from Hindus. India was not created as the Hindu nation. India was the default. Pakistan was a secession from that. India was a secular experiment. And whether or not that secular experiment would have been able to house Muslims without discrimination, that is a hypothetical that cannot be answered. But the whole point of the experiment was to create that safe haven that does not discriminate based on religious background. The history of Hindu nationalism is very much intertwined with the Pakistani liberation movement. And they're both formed in the same concept, which is two-nation theory. Two-nation theory was, I believe, initially penned by Muslim scholars who believed that Muslims could not continue to live in India. And then what the Hindu nationalists, of whom the Muslim scholars were afraid, they latched on to that rhetoric. And they said, see, like, we need to have two separate countries, because they wanted their own country. They wanted to kill Muslims too. But they knew that the first step was to establish India as a Hindu nation. It failed. It absolutely failed. India has a clear commitment to secularism that is administrated and executed extremely ineffectively and problematically. For example, India has separate civil codes based on religion. That is very problematic. What you need is a uniform, non-religious civil code that enforces the laws rigorously with Hindus as it does with Muslims or Christians or Jains or Sikhs. But the entire point of this bill is to shift the Overton window into an area in which we're talking about India as a Hindu nation. Do not let that happen. This is a secular country. Muslims have as much of a right, Indian Muslims have as much of a right to India as Indian Hindus, as Indian Christians. And people who immigrate to India as refugees, whether documented or undocumented, they all have the same right to apply for citizenship or status under the law. There is no religious litmus test. That is completely against the founding principles of India. So don't get bogged down in the bullshit. Don't get bogged down in the lies, the obfuscation, and the prevarication. CAB is designed to oppress Muslims. That is it. That is the bottom line. The second court decision, of course, was the Ayodhya temple, or the second story was the court decision to uphold the Ayodhya temple. And there's not much to talk about here. This is also not necessarily the Supreme Court being overtly Islamophobic, but definitely enabling into a larger BJP agenda, which originates back to 1992. We're going to do a proper deep dive on the Sangh Parivar, which is the Hindu right movement, and how the RSS, which was the original far-right Hindu nationalist party, a member of whose was the extremist Nathuram Godse, who assassinated Mahatma Gandhi, and they essentially underwent a transformation into from militancy into right-wing politics, and they have an overarching family that includes terrorist organizations, paramilitary organizations, youth movements, youth indoctrination movements, and their political wing, which is the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which currently holds a majority in Indian parliament. So definitely a powerful and very dangerous force. We'll get into them a little bit later, but it was their supporters and Hindu nationalists who in 1992 went to Ayodhya, which is a religious historical site for both Muslims and Hindus. Ayodhya was the in Indian mythology and Hindu mythology was the seat of one of the reincarnations of Vishnu, who is Rama, whom everyone has heard of, or anyone who's heard of any Hindu deities has heard of Ram. So Rama was said to have ruled over Ayodhya and to have been the prince of Ayodhya and then the king of Ayodhya. And so it holds a very special place to Hindus. And it's also the site of a very important Indian Muslim mosque, or was, the Babri Masjid. And the Babri Mosque was sitting on a place where Hindu nationalists thought it was disrespectful, because Hindus thought that they owned Ayodhya because of some mythological link that they had to it. So what these Hindu terrorists did was they went into Ayodhya, they demolished the Babri Mosque, and it caused riots all over the country. Like, myriads of people were killed. And those riots continued into the mid-90s. So religious conflict is, aplenty. Now that the BJP has its first absolute majority, in the past 6 years it has developed its first majority in Indian politics, they established essentially plans to build a temple, a Hindu temple, in Ayodhya, where the Babri Masjid was once built and once demolished. So once again, this fits into a very, very clear agenda on the part of the Hindu right, which is to redefine India as a Hindu nation, to get rid of Muslim monuments and replace them with Hindu monuments, to completely cut off any form of injection of Muslim population representation from the Northeast, where it's most common, and to redefine Northeastern Muslim identity as fundamentally non-Indian. And that's the beginning. Once that change goes through, they're going to turn to the Muslims we have in our country. And in India, they're going to turn to Muslims, and they're going to start taking away Muslim Indian identity domestically. This completely fits into the Hindu fascist narrative. This fits into any fascist narrative. Any tribalist fascist narrative continually oppresses further and further within its circle. And there's no endpoint to it. It can't succeed. It cannot survive. But it can destroy everyone around it and take everyone down with it. Because Hindu fascism, Hindu nationalism, ethnic nationalism, white fascism, all of these are ideologies based on exclusion. That is not what India was founded on. That is not what America was founded on. White and Hindu nationalism are diametrically opposed to the liberal values that we espouse. Just something to take away with. And don't get sucked into the bullshit. Understand, CAB is about oppressing Muslims. It's about keeping Muslims out. And it's about creating a diametric opposition between Muslim identity and Indian identity. And this is an opposition, a mutual exclusion that has never existed in the history of that country. And the court decision, deplorable, highly unfortunate, not necessarily Islamophobic on the court's part, but definitely fits into BJP's larger agenda. And these are things that should concern everyone, not just people who look like me. So that was my final topic. Thanks to everyone who watched. We're going to have VODs of this up, and hopefully I'm going to do another episode covering the Democratic presidential debate tomorrow. The the episode won't be tomorrow, but I'll do a recap hopefully over the weekend or maybe sometime before the end of the year. Yeah, stay tuned for more political content. And thank you all very much for watching, and have a wonderful, wonderful night.
Come gather round, people, wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accepted that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are changing. Some writers and critics, you prophesize with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming. For the loser now will be later to win, for the times they are changing. Some senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall, for he that gets hurt will be he who has stalled. For the battle outside raging will soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are changing. Some mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are changing. The line it is drawn and the curse it is cast. The slowest one now will later be fast, as the present now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading.